Okay. Comparative politics. Populism. We're putting this in the non-democracy section. Um, you can have populist movements inside of democracies, um, but we're putting it inside of this section for a reason that I'll note in a moment. Um, so, what is it? People have a general idea of what it is, but this one's particularly tricky. First thing I need you to know about populism, it does, you know, derive from the same word as popular, um, but it's not necessarily a positive thing. And in fact, academics and people who study populism generally view it negatively. Um, and it doesn't just mean popular. Populism is much, much more specific. So let me give you some examples of some movements, recent movements that I would say are and are not populist. Um, and then I'll go through the characteristics of populism, and you can think about it from that standpoint. Hopefully, those two things will come together. Uh, Donald Trump and the whole movement around Donald Trump. What you might have heard this term Trumpism. I use this. Is unquestionably a populist movement. Um, Obama, when he ran originally in 2008, um, was not a populist movement. And then you might, in your impression, you might sort of feel like, wait, what's the difference? Because it may feel like both of those were pretty similar in terms of um, how that movement was built and how it occurred and how both Donald Trump and previously Barack Obama got the nominations for their parties and then were elected. So, for example, Barack Obama is only in the Senate for a few years and then runs for president as a very young man, as someone very new to the system against Hillary Clinton, and who was heavily favored to win. And he creates this enormous movement from the grassroots and goes through the primaries and defeats Clinton despite her support from the party and the system. So it really feels like he's coming up against the system. And that kind of feels populist, right? The whole idea of the hope and change and all that, those key words from his 2008 campaign, it kind of feels populist. No, he's not populist. All right, now let's take a look at why that might be. Populism can mean different things to different people, and there's been a lot written about it, and there's a lot of uncertainty. What I do is I have a good friend from graduate school who's a leading expert on populism. He's written multiple books on it. One very good one called Populism. His name's Paul Taggart at a UK University of Sussex. He what he did is he went back and looked at all the literature on populism to compare what the different theories were about populism, and then he looked back at all the different populist movements in history and identified 6 characteristics of populist movements. So it's important to note what's in there and what's not in there. So one of them is that populism is always a response to some kind of crisis, usually an external crisis. What do we mean by this? Something big, comes along inside of a country, maybe it's globally, but inside of a country, there's a big crisis. Maybe it's a Great Depression. Maybe it's something a little bit less than that, like the 2009 recession. Maybe a country loses a war. Maybe there's, a famine, some kind of horrific environmental catastrophe occurs, and a country is going through great problems. That's when we see populist movements arise and take power. Okay. So, for both Barack Obama and Donald Trump, those were in place because Barack Obama is seeking the election. He's already gotten the nomination, though, by the time the economy collapses. But of course, Trump is coming a few years after that, when the effects of the Great Recession are still very much in place. Okay? So that's the crisis we're talking about. Or maybe the crisis is a little different. Maybe there's going to be a crisis stemming from climate change. Or maybe there's going to be a crisis stemming from increased inequality. Okay? So you can imagine multiple potential crises that might result in populism. And lo and behold, we've seen a lot of populist movements globally. All right. Over the last 10 years. All right. There's an external crisis. There's a belief in any particular populist movement. There's this understanding or belief that there's a heartland of the country, a central core of the country where there's the good, honest citizens, the residents of the heartland, who are being abused or taken advantage of by somebody else. There's some kind of threat from somebody else. And that can be different. That can mean different things in different places. So the heartland and the heartland's enemies. Okay? So, what's the heartland in the U.S.? I don't mean like the real heartland. You can make a good argument that the real heartland of the United States, where everything actually happens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, New York City. Maybe that's it. Or just more generally, maybe it's the cities. You can make that argument. But generally, when we're talking about the heartland in the United States, we're not talking about that. We're talking about that internal part of the country, the rural areas, the farmlands, Kansas, Iowa, places like these. This is what we generally in our culture think of when we talk about the heartland. This is very much applicable to Trump and Trumpism, his entire movement and his supporters, as we know. Not applicable to Barack Obama. Who are the enemies? Well, the enemies in this U.S. case are people in Washington, the elites, the academics, the foreigners, Chinese taking advantage of us, that sort of thing. Residents of the heartland are being taken advantage of. This is a central component of populism. It may seem weird to talk about the cities as the heartland, but there have been globally populist movements that were urban-based. Okay? So the heartland might be the capital city. All right. So the heartland is being taken advantage of by certain people. The third characteristic is a disdain for traditional politics. Definitely 100% see that with Donald Trump and Trumpism. Drain the swamp, right? And not really or necessarily with Obama. You might have a little bit here and there with that. You had a little bit here and there also with the Bernie Sanders movement. This idea that the Democratic Party is inherently corrupt and needs to be reformed or replaced, right? So from that standpoint, Bernie Sanders and his movement could be seen as populist. But Bernie Sanders doesn't apply on the heartland so much. Now he does has talked a lot about rural voters and how they've been abandoned and that sort of thing. So that element is in there. But overall, globally, the Sanders movement, I'm not sure that aspect applies. So, right. So we've got those three things. Another one. The next two are closely related. Oh, wait. Let me say a little bit more about the politics. They're opposed to traditional politics. They're looking to. They have a disdain for democracy. They might use democracy, take part in democratic elections, but they really have a strong disdain for it and the way it's practiced and want something new. So in that sense, it might be radical or reactionary. Which brings me to the next point, is that there's no inherent ideology to populism. Populists believe all kinds of different things. You have populists from the left, you got populists from the right, you got populists everywhere in between. There might be populists that are focused on, that might be farmers' movements. It might be really anything. Latin America over the last 100 years has seen a lot of populists, and some of them are from the right and some of them are from the left. Obviously, Donald Trump is from the right to the extent that you might call Bernie Sanders a populist. He's from the left. Populist movements in the UK, UKIP, this is very much from the right. Other right-wing movements, especially we've seen in Europe, but not entirely right-wing. There's some also European left-wing populist movements as well that are disdainful of the traditional way of doing elections and politics in whichever European country you're in. So there's no one ideology. There's nothing that's common in terms of the beliefs about political ideology, what to do, what the role of the state should be in government, in society, and economics, culture, right? Okay. Closely related to that, populist or chameleons. Since they don't necessarily have a strong belief beyond that the heartland's getting screwed, their beliefs, their proposals, their public policy can change depending on the situation. So they may try to take power with a certain platform, and then if and when they gain control, they might switch things and switch things up as they go along. Juan Perón in Argentina, classic example of a populist, and of course his wife Eva Perón, Evita, right? The Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, Evita Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. These people are classic textbook populists. It's kind of hard to pin them down to right or left, in part because they switched. Perón and later Eva Perón, when she was leader, kind of would go back and forth on their policies. And then the last thing, this is maybe the most important thing, this is the thing that is the silver lining on the cloud, is number 6, is that they're not effective at governance. And it makes sense. And this is very much, we can make this case for Trump. They don't have experience in traditional politics. They're disdainful of traditional politics. So they come into power, and a lot of times that lack of experience and that disdain for traditional politics means they're not very good at it. So sometimes populists do take power democratically or non-democratically, but very rarely do they hold power for very long. And in part because very rarely are they effective. So that's something to chew on. Now you can take this and then read in the textbook to kind of go over it, to give you maybe a better feel for what we talk about when we talk about populism. So, next up for non-democracy is corruption. I'm going to come in and talk about that. All right.